Hello everybody, today we'll be talking about new criticism. Those of you who've been listening to me, they know that we started talking about criticism and literary theory. In fact, criticism aims at discerning, interpreting, evaluating, judging everything that goes on in a text. But if somebody tries to interpret a text according to his own personal judgment and feelings, the likelihood is that his judgment in the ultimate analysis could be marked as impressionistic criticism. It may not be that welcome in all critical circles because it will be one man's reaction to a text. Academic approach to criticizing a literary work, in fact, aims at being more critical. And what is it that we try to locate, find out, discern in a text? We try to identify the subject matter and the method of the text. The subject matter and the method of the text. Subject matter obviously will relate to the general themes, and the method of the text will relate to the way those general themes have been presented or developed in the text. But one thing that, in my opinion, every student of literary criticism should keep in mind is that we need to look for common human experience. We need to look for feelings. We need to look for problems that all human beings face. Many times, students of literature, at least some of them, are likely to raise objections to a literature expressing his own personal emotions or personal views about things. The students might, under the mistaken notion that this is his personal problem, they might not give it much importance. But a true writer, in fact, is the one who manages to impersonalize, universalize the personal. So the personal, in fact, in the ultimate analysis, turns out to be common human experience. It turns out to be a common problem. The feelings that he expresses, they turn out to be the feelings of all humans. Now, what does a writer do? He tries to focus his attention on the words he chooses to express his views. But as he keeps saying, views ultimately remain his views, though today we'll be talking about new criticism, which in fact, seems to be a nullification of what I'm saying. A writer focuses his attention on the words chosen. When you read a text, the one big question that comes to your mind is Is there a correct view of what a text is about? Is there a correct view of what a text is about? My knowledge of literature as a student tells me no. There isn't any correct view of the text that one could be very certain about. And on many occasions, the responses of the reader are socially and culturally conditioned. It means that our criticism, our evaluation, our interpretation remains socially contextualized. It remains culturally contextualized. Maybe we can't help it. We've got to read a book. We've got to give our judgment being members of a society. And as I often tell my students, being human necessitates surviving in a social milieu. If you are human beings, you do not survive up there in the ether. You've got to have human beings around. So at any one particular point in time, your responses are likely to be socially and culturally conditioned. And this is probably why up to the 18th century included, moral effect of literature remained dominant in literary evaluations. Moral effect of literature. Up to the 18th century, we've been believing that literature probably has to be so molded, so written, so expressed that it achieves the traditionally attached motive to literary pursuits, and that is that it has to accomplish the goal of pleasurable teaching. Literature has to please as well as teach. This is what people believed. And then, of course, moral considerations, that it should help people mend their morals or improve their morals or refine their morals. Being a student of literature, we all know that a writer, in many cases, is believed to be a product of the society that he inheres in or lives in or resides in. A product of the society. And I am reminded of a few history books. The one that impressed me a great deal was one, History of English Literature, written by Wimsatt and Brooks. History of English Literature. History analyzes a social scene on three parameters. What is the social scene like? What is the economic scene like? What is the political scene like? So, economics and politics, obviously, they impact society a great deal. And your social milieu seems to be an outcome of whatever goes on in your society economically and politically. So a good history book gives you, if it is the 14th century, the history book will give you the economic scene, the history book will give you the political scene, and then in the light of these two, try to conclude the social changes that take place because of the first two. Economy impacts your life, and political changes impact your life, and ultimately you have something that we call social scene. So it was probably inevitable for the people up to the 18th century to attribute the goal of pleasurable teaching to literature. But something extremely fascinating and interesting occurred around the end of the 18th century and beginning of the 19th century. I'm trying to allude to the Romantic Revolution. Rationality seemed to dominate the scene in the 18th century, but around the end of the 18th century and beginning of the 19th century, people began to attach a lot of importance to the emotions of the writer. The emotions of the writer. And those of you who were here last time, they remember we started talking about M.H. Abrams, The Mirror and the Lamp. And I refer to the very first chapter in his book, The Mirror and the Lamp, Orientation of Civilization or Cultures. In that book, he says that a literary work could be looked at in three ways. A literary work could be an expression of a person's feelings and thoughts. A literary work could be intended to bring about certain salutary changes in the society around, and that is something we refer to as pragmatic theory. And if he is simply trying to express his own emotions, we refer to it as the expressive theory of literary criticism. And if he is simply commenting on the things around using Aristotelian jargon, he is imitating the universe, and that is what we refer to as mimetic theory. The revolution that the Romantics were trying to bring about is, in fact, referring to the expressive theory, where Wordsworth says, "My heart leaps with joy when I behold a rainbow in the sky." Or when he says, "Whenever on my couch I lie, whenever on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude, and then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils." This sort of literary work, where the emphasis is on the first person pronoun, where the emphasis is on the expression of emotions, is labeled as, those who criticize this work, they label it as romantic criticism. But remarkable changes took place in the field of criticism in the 20th century. 20th century, extremely important in this respect. I remember when I happened to be talking about Sydney or Shakespeare or Spencer, even Bacon, I cannot help talking about the fact that the 16th century, the century of Renaissance, is the golden period in the history of English literature. But since I also happen to be a student of linguistics as well as literature, now I happen to be of the opinion that 20th century is extremely fertile in respect of critical approaches. Extremely fertile in respect of critical approaches, 20th century. Because the emphasis in critical discussions sometimes has been on the author, sometimes it has been on the text, sometimes it has been on the reader. And because traditional critical approaches or critical theory tended to focus on social, historical approach, it ignored, or at least tended to ignore, the text. The text remained ignored for quite some time. But as English, established itself as an academic discipline, text became the focus. So in the 20th century, we notice that the author, no. The reader, no. The text becomes the locus of somebody's attention. The text becomes the most important element in literary discussions. In England, around the beginning of the 20th century, the man who focused his attention on the text a great deal, the first man, the first writer, F.R. Lewis, a professor of English literature at Cambridge University in the 60s and very early 70s. For the first time, he came out with an extremely revolutionary, I would say, approach. And that revolutionary approach was attaching maximum importance to the text. He began to advocate close reading of the text. Attention was called to the words on the page. The words on the page. It did not, as far as F.R. Lewis is concerned at least, he did not reject expressive criticism, but began to be of the opinion and teach the same, preach the same, that text is an aesthetic construct. Text, an aesthetic construct. It's an entity. It's a beautiful vase with pictures inscribed on it. We'll talk about these things too in a short while. Text, he thought, was an aesthetic concert. A text, he was of the opinion, is not a social document. Neither is it a philosophical statement. Neither a social document nor a philosophical statement. So, attention was focused entirely on the text and also on the importance of what it says. And what was the goal? If we say that the new critics, they focused or tended to focus or advocated focusing entire attention on the text, what was the end? What was the end in view? Why so? They, in fact, were doing so with a view to appreciating its intellectual and aesthetic qualities. Focusing on a text with a view to appreciating its intellectual and aesthetic qualities. What is it that somebody is saying, and how is it that somebody is saying? And this, incidentally, happens to be a matter of prime interest to the linguists. Something that we'll be talking about later. Structuralism and post-structuralism. We'll be talking about that too later on. But at the moment, since we happen to be focusing our attention on new criticism, it is different from traditional philological or historical approach. It is different from socially and culturally conditioned approaches. It focuses on the text. And text, analyzing it. In fact, the first man who initiated all this discussion was I.A. Richards. When did somebody create a literary work? And who that somebody was? These two W's to them, probably not that important. When and who? Not important. Lewis, F.R. Lewis, blended artistry and effect of the work. Artistry and effect of the work. And when I use these two expressions, artistry and effect of the work, I'm reminded of T.S. Eliot's impersonality theory. He too is of the opinion that the mind of the writer is a catalyst. Diverse emotions and feelings come to his mind. But the emotion of art, we could even call it the passion of art, dominates. As if he were saying that the writer is more interested in creating an aesthetic or establishing or erecting an aesthetic edifice. The writer is interested in establishing, erecting an aesthetic edifice. The pressure to create something beautiful is there. His own emotion, his own feelings, they seem to get somewhat suppressed, and the emotion or the passion of art begins to be dominant. It begins to dominate. Now, the new critics, this is what T.S. Eliot said, that the mind of the poet is a catalyst. It means we may differ with him, being students of literature. Personally, I don't feel induced to agree to what T.S. Eliot says 100%. Because being students of literature, we have every right to have our own opinion about things. We have every right to come out with something different, provided we have the ability and the capacity to substantiate whatever we are maintaining with the help of suitable, plausible arguments and explication. But Eliot believes, T.S. Eliot, that a poet should not let his own personality interfere. In fact, he says, writing a poetry, something diametrically opposed to what words were said. What is it that words were said? He said poetry is, what is it? Expression of emotions. He said feelings, expressed in tranquility. Feelings expressed in tranquility, recollected in tranquility. Recollected in tranquility. Eliot is of the opinion that it is none of this. It's not an expression of personality. It is rather an escape from personality. Now, it would be a separate discussion, whether or not it would be possible for one to escape one's personality. But this is what T.S. Eliot maintained. New criticism proponents happen to be maintaining the same. They believe in attaching, in fact, he's one of the greats who contributed ideas to the formulation of what nowadays we call new criticism. Blackmer, Alan Tate, and Wimsatt, Empson, people, who contributed a great deal to these ideas. But what do they do when they read literary work? They, in fact, try to reveal the complexity. It means they are more interested in locating complexity. Or is it that human feelings have got to be complex? This is for us to think about. Because new critics, they were interested in revealing the complexity and subtlety of what was being said. Complexity and subtlety of what was being said. Complexity and subtlety. Students of literature would easily recall the complexity and subtlety that we come across in Donne's poetry, John Donne's poetry, wherein he uses metaphysical conceits, wherein he talks about being able to identify the similarities between things, not using your senses, but using your intellect. And consequently, his notorious, conceit of a pair of compasses to talk about himself and his beloved. Identifying similarities between two things, an intellectual exercise. Mind needed to do so, discerning the similarities, not the senses. This is what gives you metaphysical poetry and metaphysical conceits, by the way. But these people, Cleanth Brooks, R.P. Blackmer, R.S. Crane, Robert Penn Warren, Austin Warren, Booth, Alan Tate, all these American critics, and John Crowe Ransom, to top all of them. The most dominant, practitioner and theoretician of new criticism published his book an essay, in fact, The New Criticism in 1941. Once again, we can say, if I use his words, I can say that the tendency in recent criticism, and by recent I mean early 20th century criticism, and I quote, to emphasize the close reading and explication of a text rather than biographical or historical study. Close reading. And by so doing, this tribe of new critics, they excelled in the interpretation of complex, highly intellectual poems. Besides, their attention is constantly centered on linguistic organization of poetry. And this is probably why they seem to focus their attention on short lyrics. And to be more specific, more importantly, on John Donne's lyrics. To them, a work of art, we've been talking about Eliot's impersonality theory, to the new critics too, a work of art is an object in itself. And they find in a work of art a special kind of language opposed to, or at least different from, the languages of science and philosophy. A special kind of language. And then they examine this language through a process of analysis. It means that new criticism tends to ally itself with that school in contemporary criticism which believes most completely in the objective theory of art. They believe in the objective theory of art because a literary work to them is an object. But new critics, not all of them happen to have all similar ideas. They are a cluster of attitudes. In fact, in new criticism, we come across a cluster of attitudes rather than an organized critical system. And the goal, once again, we could say, was to center attention on discovering the real worth of literature. And to demonstrate that worth to intelligent readers. To defend that worth against the type of attack they believe to be inherent in contemporary thought. In American new criticism, we notice that this criticism owes a great deal to I.A. Richards, Lewis, and Empson. If you ask me, what is the most prominent feature of new criticism? And I'm not being original here. Most of the great ones happen to have the same opinion, and that is the autonomy of literature is a vital tenet of new criticism. The autonomy of literature, a vital tenet of new criticism. A poem, once again, you'll have to put up with me for this Brief repetition. Once again, a poem, not a piece of biographical or sociological evidence. A poem, not a literary or historical material. Nor is it a demonstration of a psychological theory of literature or for any other reason. And when doing so, they pointed out the various wrongful ways of looking at literature. Various wrongful ways of looking at literature. The first thing that they pointed out was intentional fallacy. Intentional fallacy. The title of an essay by the American critics, Wimsatt and Beardsley, Intentional Fallacy. Printed in Wimsatt's The Verbal Icon, 1954. What is intentional fallacy? They argue that, and I quote, judging a poem by the effect or emotional impact on the reader is a fallacious method of criticism, resulting only in impressionistic criticism. I repeat, judging a poem by the effect or emotional impact on the reader, judging a poem by the effect or emotional impact on the reader is a fallacious method of criticism, resulting only in impressionistic criticism. It means that this is something to them false, blatantly, glaringly false to them, the new critics. And then another fallacy. They seem to point out another fallacy, and that is intentional fallacy. The American new critics, Wimsatt and Beardsley, introduced this term for what they regarded as, and I quote, the mistaken critical method of judging a literary work according to the author's intentions. Mistaken critical method of judging a literary work according to the author's intentions, as if it would be possible for one to know the intention of a writer. Not many would disagree with me that being certain about the intention of a writer perhaps cannot be granted. We cannot take it for sure that we know the intention of the writer. What exactly is or was the intention of the writer? The intention may be stated or implied. They believed, and it's something apparently simple, they believed that the value, and I should hasten to add another word here, that the value and meaning of each literary work resides solely in the text itself. And any examination of presented and presumed intention is merely irrelevant. We cannot presume to have a prior knowledge of the writer's intention. Such an approach would only distract critics. We shouldn't be focusing on the writer's psychology or biography. We should instead focus our attention on the use of language. The use of language, imagery, like a pair of compasses. What pictures the words used by the writer evoke in our mind? Images, imagery, language, imagery, tensions, and so on. Because some of the paradoxes, some of the ironical statements, some of the comparisons and contrasts, they are likely to create tensions. But paradoxically, this is exactly what attracts the attention of the new critics. What are the tensions within the freestanding literary artifice? All this has been discussed by Wimsatt in his essay in The Verbal Icon. Close, winding up, we could say close reading, the only legitimate critical procedure. A literary work has got to be looked at as a linguistic structure in which all the parts are held in a tension of, as I have already said, paradox, irony, and ambiguity. Words, symbols, and images. And I have already maintained that they benefited from I.A. Richards' attempt to create a special terminology for literary effects, and his remodeling of Coleridge's ideas of form as the synthesizing element of poetry. Richards' idea, I.A. Richards' idea, that literature was written in a special non-referential language also appealed to the new critics. F.R. Lewis believed in the autonomy of literature, but he stressed its value in moral and cultural education, which means that new criticism, as believed and propagated by F.R. Lewis, did leave some room for its reconciliation with traditional approaches. But most of the new critics, they focus their attention on the text. This should be the nutshell, considering the text as an autonomous piece. Now, around the middle of the 20th century, a little after 1970s, came another movement, and that was structuralism and post-structuralism. This is something that we'll discuss in the next session. Thank you very much for giving me a patient hearing.